I'm old, you know. Well, I'm not talking about glamping. I'm not talking about the 40-foot bus with the flat screen TV, with the wet bar outside, with the barbecue and the portable jacuzzi, or the 750-channel satellite TV. No, I'm talking about who has really been camping. All right. Tent flapping in the wind, ants crawling all over your cooler, raccoons treating your campsite like a drive-through, having to hang your food in a tree to keep the bears away. That's the kind of camping I'm talking about, real camping. Well, that's where we find Abraham and Sarah in this story, living the desert nomad life. They're surrounded by dust, tents, and most likely the smell of domesticated animals. So Genesis chapter 18 opens with this. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. It was just another ordinary, hot desert day. Nothing special about it. Until God showed up. So Abraham sees three strangers. No halo, no angelic wings, no fire from heaven, just travelers needing rest. And he runs to greet them, and he bows down, and he offers them food and shelter. Now that is ancient hospitality. It's also an act of faith, because Abraham seems to sense that God is hidden in this moment, that something divine is tucked into this ordinary day. Kind of reminds me of my grandma, who lived in Grand Junction, Colorado, and we used to go visit her on a regular basis, and every night for dinner she would set an extra place at the table, just in case Jesus happens to drop by. And one time I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. I asked my grandma, I said, "Grandma, how are you going to know it's him?" And she was setting the table. She didn't even look up. She didn't blink an eye. She said, "I probably won't, but I'd rather be ready than rude." Well, Abraham doesn't wait for lightning. He shows radical hospitality in this moment. And God meets him around the campfire. And verses 6 through 10 illustrate what I like to call God's audacious promise. He says, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah will have a son." And what does Sarah do? She laughs. It's not nervous laughter. It's not a chuckle. It's a big old belly laugh. It's a 89 years old, excuse me, what kind of laugh. And honestly, I get it. I get it. She and Abraham had waited decades to have a baby. That was her heart's desire, was to have a baby. And hope had dried up for them like the desert wind. But God says, "You're not done, because I'm not done." Oh, there's Sarah. I missed Sarah laughing. I really worked hard on that slide. When I was growing up, my mom tried very hard to be a gardener. But she just seemed to fail time after time. She said, I can't tell you how many times she said this, and maybe some of you have said the same thing. She'd say, instead of a green thumb, I have a black thumb. Well, one summer, my mom gave one final try at gardening. She bought herself a little tomato plant, and she bought a nice big pot, and she put rich, fertile soil in it, and she put fertilizer in it, and she put that pot on our back patio. This was her last attempt at gardening. Well, unfortunately, she neglected it. She forgot to water it. And we all watched this tomato plant turn into a dried up brown husk in the pot on our patio. And she just gave up. But she left it sitting there on our patio all summer, I think sort of as a monument to her failure. And then came a rainstorm, a good old New Mexico gully washer. And a few days later, she finally walked out to throw her dead tomato plant away, and she saw a tiny green sprout. And she said to me, I just stared at it. She said, did you not get the memo? You're supposed to be dead. And that's what God does. Right when we're convinced it's over. When the soil is dry, when the womb is barren, when the future looks empty, God whispers, now is the time. Well, Sarah laughed at the absurdity of God's promise. And I'll just bet every single one of us would also. But you know what? God delights in doing the impossible. Not to impress, but to restore hope. And in verses 13 through 15, God asks a question that has echoed across the millennia. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? And that's the pivot point. This story is not about Abraham and Sarah's faith. Not at all. Not one little bit. This story is about God's relentless faithfulness. And this is what we call a covenant, not a contract. Now, some of you probably know I have a background in law, among all the other crazy things I've done in my life. And in law school, my most terrifying class was contracts with Professor Francisco, the meanest, most terrible, most vicious, most masochistic man who ever set foot on this planet. I was afraid to walk into the classroom in the morning for contracts. I would actually have to stand out in the doorway and will myself into the classroom. Because I don't know if you know how law school works, but essentially what they do is they have these case books that they have you read. You have to read lots and lots and lots of cases. And then you come to class, and the professor picks a victim out of the class, has them stand, and you have to recite the case. You know, what are the facts? What was the issue? What was the decision? Why did the judges decide the way they judged? And Professor Francisco, we used to call it getting Franciscoed. Professor Francisco took that as an opportunity to completely humiliate you and to prove how smart he was and how stupid you were. But I'll tell you something. I really learned contracts. Probably not out of an interest in contracts, more out of fear. But I learned it. I learned contracts. And I learned something very important in this class, which was later clarified for me when I went to seminary. Contracts say, if you do this, I'll do that. That's a contract. If you do this, I'll do that. And it's very different from a covenant. A covenant says, I will. Period. I will. Even when you laugh, even when you doubt, even when you're weak, even when you're faithless, I will. So Sarah tries to deny laughing, maybe out of fear, maybe out of shame, I don't know. But you know what? God sees her. God still loves her. God still delivers on the promise. God is not offended by Sarah's laughter. Now, many years later, God made another covenant. Not in a tent, but in a manger. Not with the promise of a child, but with a child who is the promise. Jesus Christ became the fulfillment of all of God's promises. And in the upper room, with his disciples, he said this, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you." Through Jesus, we're not just recipients of grace. We have become part of the covenant family. And in the covenant family, wanderers become beloved children. In the covenant family, laughter turns to joy. In the covenant family, barrenness gives way to new life. In the covenant family, hopelessness becomes hope. So fast forward a few thousand years, folks. I've got some news for you. We are all still camping. Maybe not in tents, but in temporary places nevertheless. Jobs change, relationships shift. We move to be closer to our kids and our grandkids mostly. Our health comes and goes, and we're all a little bit like Sarah. We're tired. We're skeptical. And we're eavesdropping on God's plans. But then Jesus comes. God, once again, appearing in the ordinary. Not as a warrior or a king with a sword on horseback, but as a child in a manger, a man who walked dusty roads, a friend who wept with his friends, a Savior who bled. And Jesus says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you." Through Christ, we are all invited into a new promise. Not of land, not of lineage, not of wealth, not of fame, not of fortune, but of life eternal, of forgiveness, of renewal, and of a spirit that never, never, never leaves us. So how do we respond to that? Well, we could do what Sarah did. You can laugh. God proved it's okay. You can laugh. But I suggest that when you're done laughing, you lean in. Because God is doing something extraordinary in the world. God is doing something extraordinary in your life. And what do we do when the promise seems impossible? You can laugh. God's not offended by your doubt. Sarah's laugh actually became part of the story. In fact, they named their son Isaac, which in Hebrew means laughter. Because What once seemed absurd became reality. Now, Karen and I just came back from a little over 3 weeks of camping. We had a wonderful camping trip. We camped all the way out to Alabama and stayed at a beautiful state park out there, Lake Guntersville, where it's like a famous bass lake. If you guys like fishing shows, Lake Guntersville shows up all the time. My brother-in-law took us out fishing, and I actually caught a bass. Well, somewhere in between, as far as that goes. We had a wonderful time camping, and then we spent a week in Texas, and we camped all the way back to home. And I got to thinking when we were out camping, and this is going to sound really silly, that one of my very favorite parts of camping is camping chairs. I know that sounds kind of strange, but it is. It's camping chairs. When the campsite is all set up and you're all done with the hard work and you built a fire and you open up that camping chair and you pour yourself a cool, refreshing drink and you sit around the fire and you talk and you look at the stars and everything gets bigger from that camping chair. I love camping chairs. But you know what I love most about camping chairs? Is they're portable. They're foldable. They don't pretend to be permanent. I got news for you, friends. Life is a camping trip. We're not here to settle. We are here to follow. And the one who walks with us, he's a God who keeps his promises. All the way from Sarah's laughter to the empty tomb. If you're in the wilderness, if you're laughing like Sarah because a promise just feels too far gone, you're in really good company. You don't need perfect faith. You just need to keep the tent flaps open. Because God still shows up in the heat of the day. God still brings resurrection to dry places. God still delivers on impossible, absurd promises.